March 14th, a few holdouts. What they find stops them cold. An underground chamber the size of a warehouse. Hospital beds arranged in perfect rows. Surgical equipment still laid out on tables. And 73 bodies. Doctors, nurses, wounded soldiers. All dead. Not from American weapons. From a single grenade detonated in the center of the room by the chief surgeon when he heard Americans approaching. This was just one of 1,500 chambers beneath Iwo Jima. And what Marines discovered in those tunnels over the following months would fundamentally change how they understood their enemy. Underground cities, armories that could supply an army for years, command centers buried 90 feet deep, barracks where men had lived for months without seeing daylight, and evidence of a level of preparation and sacrifice that made the surface battle look simple by comparison. This is what they found inside the tunnels of Iwo Jima, and why some of those discoveries still haven't been fully explored 80 years later. Before we talk about what was inside the tunnels, you need to understand the scale of what the Japanese built. This wasn't just digging holes for soldiers to hide in. This was one of the most sophisticated military engineering projects of World War II. Construction began in June 1944, 9 months before the American invasion. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima with a mission: turn the island into an impregnable fortress. He had 21,000 men and limited time. But he had something else. An island made of volcanic rock and pumice that was relatively soft and could be carved with hand tools. The work was brutal. Soldiers dug in shifts 24 hours a day. Temperatures inside the partially completed tunnels exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The volcanic heat radiating from the rock made men pass out after 30 minutes of work. They'd rotate crews constantly. Dig for half an hour. Rest for 2 hours. Dig again. No power equipment. Everything done with picks, shovels, and dynamite. The tunnels had to be carved carefully to avoid collapse. Support beams were installed using lumber shipped from Japan. Ventilation shafts were drilled upward to the surface at precise angles to allow air circulation without revealing the tunnel locations. By February 1945, they'd completed 11 miles of main tunnels with over 1,500 separate chambers. But the truly impressive part was how they connected. This wasn't a random network. This was a designed system with multiple redundancies. 5 separate tunnel complexes, each self-sufficient, each connected to the others by deep passages that ran beneath the American artillery range. The northern complex, centered under Hill 382, was the largest, 3 levels deep. The upper level for troop movement and rapid deployment. The middle level for ammunition storage and supply distribution. The deepest level for command functions and critical infrastructure. Marines who eventually explored it compared it to a multi-story parking garage carved into solid rock. The southern complex under Mount Suribachi was smaller but more elaborate. Narrower tunnels designed for defense rather than logistics. Multiple dead ends to confuse attackers. Firing ports that allowed defenders to shoot into the tunnels themselves, creating kill zones where Americans would be trapped in crossfire. Each major chamber had multiple entrances and exits. Some positions had 5 or 6 different ways in or out. This meant that even if Americans discovered and blocked one entrance, defenders could still access the position from another direction. Clearing these chambers became a nightmare because you could never be sure you'd found all the access points. The ventilation system was genius. Shafts disguised to look like natural cracks in the rock. Some were only 6 inches across, but extended hundreds of feet to the surface. Air would flow through these shafts naturally due to temperature differences between the tunnels and the surface. Even when the surface was being pounded by naval bombardment, Fresh air circulated underground. Water collection systems channeled rainwater into underground cisterns. Some of these cisterns held thousands of gallons. The Japanese knew they'd be cut off from resupply, so they built the capacity to sustain the garrison indefinitely on collected rainwater alone. Electric lighting in some sections, generators positioned in chambers with dedicated ventilation to exhaust the fumes, miles of electrical cable running through conduits carved into the tunnel walls. When the generators ran, you could navigate major tunnels without flashlights. Communications infrastructure included telephone lines connecting all major positions. Command could talk to any unit instantly without using radio, which Americans could intercept. This internal telephone network meant coordination between positions even when the surface was chaos. Storage capacity was staggering. When Marines finally cataloged what they found, the numbers were almost unbelievable. Ammunition chambers containing millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. Artillery shells stacked floor to ceiling. Mortar rounds, grenades, explosives. Enough to fight for years, not months. Food storage included rice, canned goods, dried fish, and preserved vegetables. Enough to feed 21,000 men for 6 months on full rations. The Japanese planners knew resupply was impossible once the battle started, so they stockpiled everything beforehand. Medical supplies filled multiple chambers. Bandages, antiseptics, surgical equipment, medicine, everything needed to treat thousands of wounded without any external support. The underground hospitals weren't improvised. They were purpose-built surgical facilities with operating tables, sterilization equipment, and recovery wards. What the Americans didn't understand during the initial invasion was that they were fighting an enemy that didn't need the surface. The Japanese could conduct the entire battle from underground, emerging only to fire weapons and then disappearing back into the earth. The tunnels weren't just defensive positions. They were the actual battlefield. The Marines knew about tunnels. Intelligence had reported that the Japanese were digging. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted some cave entrances, but nobody understood the scale until they started finding them during the battle. February 23, 1945. The American flag goes up on Mount Suribachi, the iconic moment. But what the flag raisers didn't know was that directly beneath them, hundreds of Japanese soldiers occupied tunnels inside the mountain. They could hear the Americans celebrating above their heads. They waited in silence for orders that never came to emerge and counterattack. The first major tunnel discovery happened during the fight for Hill 382 in early March. A Marine patrol was advancing across what appeared to be empty ground when the earth beneath one soldier's feet gave way. He fell 15 feet into a tunnel and found himself face to face with a Japanese soldier. Both men were so shocked they froze. The Marines' squad threw grenades down the hole. The explosions revealed that the hole connected to a much larger system. Engineers were called in. They lowered lights into the opening and saw passages extending in multiple directions. The decision was made to explore. Volunteers crawled down with pistols and flashlights. What they found was their first glimpse of the underground city. A main tunnel 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, reinforced with timber and stretching into darkness in both directions. Side passages branching off every 50 feet. Electric lights hanging from the ceiling, though the power was off. Telephone wires stapled to the walls. This wasn't a crude cave. This was infrastructure. The squad followed the tunnel for 200 feet before encountering the first chamber. A barracks room with bunks built into the walls, 30 sleeping spaces, footlockers still containing personal items, rice bowls on a table, a calendar on the wall marked up to February 19th, the day the invasion started. The occupants had left in a hurry. They pressed deeper. More chambers. an armory with rifles stacked in racks, a command post with maps still pinned to the walls showing Japanese defensive positions, a radio room with equipment that had been smashed before abandonment. Each discovery revealed more about how the Japanese had planned to fight. Then they found the first bodies, a sealed chamber that had been used as an aid station. 12 wounded Japanese soldiers, all dead. Cause of death wasn't immediately obvious. No visible wounds beyond their original injuries. One Marine noticed the grenade fragments embedded in the walls. The wounded had been killed by their own forces rather than left for Americans to capture. This became a pattern. Over the following days, as more tunnel systems were discovered and explored, Marines repeatedly found chambers where the Japanese had conducted organized killings of their own wounded. Not murders, exactly. More like mercy killings performed by medical staff following orders. The wounded who couldn't walk were given morphine if available, then killed with grenades. Quick, clean, final. The psychological impact on the Marines who found these scenes was profound. Enemy soldiers were supposed to die fighting. Finding them executed by their own side in clinical, organized fashion was disturbing in a different way. It suggested a level of commitment and ruthlessness that went beyond normal military discipline. One discovery haunted an entire company. They breached a chamber and found 30 Japanese soldiers sitting in a circle, all dead, all facing inward. In the center was a single grenade pin. They'd pulled the pin, placed the grenade in the middle, and waited for it to detonate. Group suicide performed with perfect order and discipline. Personal items were stacked neatly along the walls. Farewell letters to families. Each man had written his final message before dying. The letters were translated later. They weren't propaganda. They were personal. Apologies to parents for dying before them. Messages to wives and children. Expressions of hope that their deaths would mean something. Reading those letters forced Marines to confront the humanity of the enemy they were fighting. These weren't monsters. They were men who believed dying was better than surrender. But the darkest discovery came in mid-March, when engineers opened a large chamber under the Central Highlands, a hospital. But not like any hospital the Marines had seen before. This one was still occupied. March 14, 1945. The chamber that stopped the demolition team cold. They'd blown the concealed entrance and entered expecting abandoned space. Instead, they found a fully equipped underground surgical facility with 73 dead. The layout was methodical, an entrance chamber serving as triage, equipment for initial assessment, bloody bandages still on the floor. Then the main surgical theater. 3 operating tables made from wooden planks padded with straw and cloth. Surgical instruments laid out on trays, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, everything needed for field surgery. The lighting system was elaborate. Oil lamps positioned around each table for maximum illumination. Reflective metal sheets on the walls to bounce light onto the surgical field. In the darkness of a tunnel 60 feet underground, the surgeons had created enough light to perform complex operations. The recovery ward was the largest section. Rows of wooden bunks, 50 in total, arranged with narrow aisles between them. Each bunk had been occupied. The bodies were still there, wounded soldiers who had been patients when the end came. They showed no signs of struggle. Most appeared to have been unconscious or heavily sedated when they died. The doctors and nurses were in the surgical theater. 6 medical personnel identifiable by their armbands. They'd gathered in the center of the room. The blast pattern on the walls told the story. Someone had held a grenade at chest level while the others stood close. The detonation killed all 6 instantly. Personal effects scattered around the hospital revealed who these people were. Dr. Matsumoto, chief surgeon, age 42. 3 assistant surgeons in their 30s. 2 nurses whose identification couldn't be determined because their papers were destroyed in the blast. They'd stayed with their patients until American voices were heard approaching, then made their final decision. What made this discovery particularly haunting was the evidence of their work. Medical logs documenting hundreds of surgeries performed over the previous 3 weeks. Amputations, bullet extractions, shrapnel removal, treatment of burns. The doctors had been working around the clock trying to save wounded men in impossible conditions. Supply inventories showed they'd started with adequate medicine and bandages. By early March, they were rationing everything. Morphine reserved for only the most severe cases. Bandages washed and reused until they fell apart. Antiseptics diluted to make them last longer. They'd been doing battlefield medicine with diminishing resources and no hope of resupply. One journal found in the surgical theater belonged to Dr. Matsumoto. The entries grew shorter and more desperate as days passed. Early entries discussed surgical techniques and patient outcomes. Later entries were just tallies. How many died today? How many saved? The final entry, dated March 13th, said simply, "No more morphine, no more hope. We did our duty." The Marines who discovered this hospital were veteran combat troops. They'd seen death in every form. But this affected them differently. These weren't enemy combatants. These were medical personnel who died rather than abandon their patients. The moral complexity was uncomfortable. American medics were called in to examine the bodies and determine cause of death. Their report concluded that the patients had been given lethal injections before the grenade was detonated. Analysis of the remaining medical supplies found several empty vials of sedatives that would be fatal in high doses. The doctors had euthanized their patients before killing themselves. This raised questions that had no easy answers. Was it murder or mercy? The patients were doomed anyway. American forces didn't take many prisoners, especially not wounded prisoners who couldn't move. The doctors knew what was coming. They chose to end it on their own terms. But other discoveries in the hospital complicated the narrative. A storage room contained detailed medical records for every patient. Names, hometowns, next of kin, injuries sustained, treatment provided. The doctors had maintained meticulous records even as their situation became hopeless. Why? Because they believed these records might someday reach the families, that the dead deserved to be documented and remembered. One entire wall was covered with farewell messages written by wounded soldiers who knew they weren't leaving the tunnel alive. Messages to parents, to wives, to children, some poetic, some simple. All heartbreaking. Tell my son I died bravely. Tell my mother I'm sorry. Tell my wife I thought of her at the end. The Marines collected these messages. They were sent to military intelligence for translation. Eventually, after the war, some were returned to Japan and delivered to families. Decades later, family members of soldiers who died in that hospital would visit Iwo Jima and leave flowers at the sealed entrance. The hospital wasn't unique. As more tunnels were explored, more underground medical facilities were discovered. Smaller ones, usually, but all following the same pattern. Equipped, organized, abandoned only when Americans were literally at the entrance, and almost always ending the same way. The medical staff dying alongside or just after their patients. The psychological impact accumulated. Marines started refusing to enter newly discovered medical chambers. The scenes were too disturbing, not because of gore or violence, because of the humanity. Because seeing the enemy take care of their wounded with such dedication made it harder to dehumanize them, and you needed to dehumanize the enemy to keep fighting. While the medical facilities were the most emotionally complex discoveries, the living quarters revealed something equally important: how Japanese soldiers had actually lived underground for months before and during the battle. The barracks chambers were larger than expected. Some could house 100 men. Bunks built into the walls in 2 or 3 tiers. Each soldier had a space about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Not comfortable, but adequate. Foot lockers for personal items. Rifles stacked in racks along the walls. Everything organized with military precision. But what struck the Marines was the personalization. These weren't temporary fighting positions. These were homes. Photos of families pinned to the rock walls, drawings and paintings created by soldiers during their months underground. Small altars with religious items, books, writing materials, chess sets. Evidence that men had been living here, not just surviving. One barracks chamber had a wall covered with names and hometowns. Every soldier in the unit had signed their name and written where they were from. A memorial to who they were before they became soldiers. The wall also had dates. The day they arrived on Iwo Jima. The day they entered the tunnels. Some had added predicted dates of death. Several were accurate. Food storage areas showed how the Japanese had planned to survive. Rice in sealed barrels, dried fish packed in salt, canned vegetables, soy sauce in large containers, tea, even sake for ceremonial purposes. Enough variety to maintain morale, not just sustain life. The quartermaster who'd organized this understood that men living underground needed more than calories. They needed food that reminded them of home. Water cisterns were engineering marvels, carved into the volcanic rock and lined with cement to prevent seepage. Rainwater channeled through carefully designed gutters flowed into these chambers. Filtration systems using sand and charcoal removed impurities. The water was clean enough to drink even after weeks of storage. Some cisterns held 5,000 gallons, enough for the garrison to survive months without rain. Bathing facilities existed in some complexes, small chambers with drains carved into the floor. Water could be heated using the volcanic heat radiating through the rock. Not luxurious, but functional. The Japanese military understood that hygiene affected morale and health. Even underground, even preparing to die, they maintained standards. Latrines were sophisticated, deep pits with ventilation shafts carrying odors away from living areas. Wooden seats built over the pits. Lime storage for sanitation. The system was designed to support thousands of men without creating disease problems. Marine engineers who examined these facilities admitted they were better designed than some American field latrines. Recreational areas surprised the Marines most. Chambers designated for off-duty activities. Boards painted on walls for games. Small libraries of books. Writing desks where soldiers could compose letters they knew would never be sent. Some chambers had instruments, flutes, small drums, evidence that soldiers had tried to maintain humanity even in these conditions. One chamber contained a shrine, Buddhist altar, Shinto religious items, space for meditation and prayer. The walls were covered with prayers written by soldiers, asking for courage, for protection for their families, for Japan's victory, for a good death. The shrine had been maintained carefully until the final days. Fresh offerings of rice and water dated to just before that section of tunnels was abandoned. Personal diaries were found throughout the living quarters. Most Marines couldn't read them, but translators working after the battle discovered a wealth of information about daily life underground. The diaries talked about the heat, the darkness, the fear, but also the camaraderie, the shared purpose, the belief that their sacrifice mattered. One diary, written by a 19-year-old private, described his first month underground. The disorientation of never seeing the sun. The struggle to sleep when you couldn't tell day from night. The way sounds echoed strangely in the tunnels. But he also wrote about his squad mates, how they joked to maintain morale, how they shared food and encouraged each other, how they'd become like brothers. His final entry, dated February 20th, the second day of the invasion, said, "The Americans are here. We hear their ships. Soon we will fight. I am afraid but ready. Tell my mother I tried to be brave. Tell my father I remembered his teachings. Tell my sister to marry well and be happy. I will do my duty." The body was found in that chamber, the diary clutched in his hand. He'd been writing when the ceiling collapsed during a naval bombardment. Killed instantly. Never fired a shot at the enemy. Just one of thousands who died in the tunnels without ever seeing the Americans they were fighting. These discoveries humanized the enemy in ways that combat didn't. On the surface, Japanese soldiers were targets. Underground, they were people. Young men far from home, scared but committed, living in conditions that would break most people, trying to maintain dignity and purpose, even while preparing to die. The ultimate prize for American intelligence was finding General Kuribayashi's command center. They knew it existed somewhere deep underground. Finding it became an obsession. It took weeks. Kuribayashi had designed the command center to be undetectable. It was buried 90 feet beneath the surface, in the most hardened section of the tunnel network. Multiple false entrances led to dead ends or trapped chambers. The real entrance was disguised as a collapsed tunnel section. April 3, 1945. 2 weeks after the battle was officially declared over. A marine engineering team was mapping tunnel systems when they discovered an anomaly. A sealed section that didn't match the maps captured from earlier command posts. They drilled through and found open space beyond. Breaching the seal revealed a descending passage, wooden stairs going down at a steep angle. The stairs were intact, well constructed, designed for frequent use. At the bottom, 90 feet down, a reinforced door, locked from inside. They blew it open. The command center was larger than expected. Multiple chambers. The first was a communications room. Radio equipment, though destroyed before abandonment. Telephone switchboards connecting to the entire tunnel network. Maps on every wall showing defensive positions, American landing zones, artillery coordinates. Everything needed to command the battle. The second chamber was Kuribayashi's office and living quarters. Simple. A desk, a cot. Personal items minimal. But the walls were covered with documents. Orders issued. Reports received. Casualty tallies. Everything documented meticulously, even as the situation deteriorated. Kuribayashi's personal effects were carefully arranged. His uniform, his sword, family photos, letters from his wife and children. He'd left them there deliberately, arranged like an altar. These items were later returned to his family in Japan. The most valuable discovery was the planning documents. Complete operational plans for the defense of Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi's strategic thinking laid out in detail. His predictions about where Americans would land, how they'd advance, what tactics they'd use. He'd been remarkably accurate. Intelligence reports from before the invasion, information about American forces, equipment, likely strategies. Some of this intelligence was sophisticated enough to concern American commanders. How did the Japanese know so much about American plans? The source was never definitively identified. Casualty reports updated daily during the battle, each unit reporting their status, the numbers declining steadily. Kuribayashi had watched his garrison die unit by unit through these reports. The final report, dated March 25th, showed fewer than 300 combat-effective troops remaining from the original 21,000. Kuribayashi's final message was found on his desk, addressed to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. Never sent because communications were already cut. The message was brief. The battle is ending. All units have fought magnificently. I apologize for failing to defend this island. I pray for Japan's victory and my emperor's long life. I go now to join my men. The command center also contained evidence of Kuribayashi's final plan. Maps showing routes for a last attack against American positions. Unit assignments for a final banzai charge. But the plan was crossed out. Notes in the margins explained why. Not enough men. Not enough ammunition. Too weak from lack of food and water. The final charge never happened because it was impossible. What happened to Kuribayashi remains uncertain. Some evidence suggests he led a small group in a final attack on March 26th and died in combat. Other evidence suggests he committed suicide in the command center after writing his final message. His body was never positively identified.